Okay. So since last class we talked about animal disease, today we're going to kind of continue on that topic and talk a little bit about animal health, therapeutics, immunology, and vaccines. So just a little overview of animal health and kind of what that entails. So there has been a shift in thinking from treating clinical disease more towards disease prevention, because obviously if you can prevent the disease before it ever happens, then that's better than having to deal with it once it has happened. So producers and people take different steps to promote animal health. Some of these we kind of mentioned a little bit on Tuesday with the animal disease lecture. So biosecurity is a really big one. Sanitation, monitoring health status and vet care, optimizing nutrition is a big one, reducing stress, also really important, and then prophylaxis, so vaccination and prophylactic drugs, as well as therapeutic drugs. So biosecurity, which I kind of mentioned a little bit before, is basically just a series of measures that attempts to prevent pathogens from reaching a herd or a flock of animals. So if you have a farm, you may want to put a biosecurity plan in place, and that involves assessing what the risks are and what chances there are for your animals to be exposed to pathogens, and kind of assess those to limit that. And I'll go a little bit more into detail in the next slide. So development and implementation of policies, and make sure that employees are trained and that those who visit the facilities understand that you do have biosecurity measures in place. This is typically really important for like swine production and chicken production, poultry production, where they'll have like a shower in, shower out policy, which we'll go into detail in some of the measures. But so making sure that everyone at your facility is aware, and that visitors are aware if they're coming to visit your facility, that they may need to check in with somebody before they just walk in. Limiting visitor access is also good. If the visitors don't have to really come, then you don't have to worry about them bringing pathogens. Of course, that's not always the case because people are going to be coming to the farm. Disposable overalls and things like that to have for people on hand is also good. So these are just some biosecurity measures that you could put in place. And I will say, after visiting commercial hog farms, they have pretty much all of these in place, if not more. So if you do have a commercial or any sort of swine or especially poultry operation, these are things you might want to implement. So changing clothes, because if someone's been in contact with other animals of the same species or species that have a zoonotic disease, you don't want anything that could be on their clothes going into the facility. Shower in, shower out. So for example, when I had to go visit hog farms, I have to shower in upon arrival, and then put on a new set of overalls, shoes, socks, everything. And then before I leave that facility, I have to shower again on my way out. So this can get pretty tedious. I've heard of people that had to visit like multiple pig barns next to each other and had to shower in and shower out of each one. So they showered like 6 times in 2 hours. But it is to protect the animals and to limit the number of pathogens. Plastic shoe covers are always good, because if you're working around animals, you're walking around like in their pen or something, a lot of pathogens and things could get stuck to your shoes. And people are really uptight about that. Like, I was supposed to go to a pig farm, and I was not allowed to go to the state fair before that visit because people were walking in the livestock area where the pigs were and walking out into the fair, and they thought that just me walking around the fair would be enough to get it on my shoes. So some people are very, very intense about this. So foot baths with disinfectant to clean shoes. But more than likely, if a farm has this in place, you're going to be getting new boots upon arrival or boot covers. Cleaning vehicles before the visit, and then cleaning vehicles after the visit. So basically power washing them down in case they've like been on a farm and kind of kicked stuff up. Limiting visitors, again, like I said. And then documenting visitors and when they last were in contact with animals of that species. So I've had to go, and when I go to a farm, I have to check in with someone at the front office before I can even go into the farm. And they write my name, and then they'll ask you, based on what their policy is, have you been in contact with pigs in the last week? Some of them may be more strict, some of them may be 3 days. So just if you are in a situation where you do have to go to a commercial farm, just be aware of those and limit your exposure to animals of that species at least a week before. Any questions on biosecurity or any of these? Okay. So immunology, which is something I got a lot of questions on yesterday, so hopefully I'm prepared for this section. We're going to talk a little bit about immunology because obviously that's a big part of animal health. So there are two systems that protect an animal and will mount a defense to pathogen. So there's innate immunity and then adaptive immunity. And we'll talk a little bit more in specifics about which one of, or what those two do and how they help prevent a pathogen infection. So these systems exist in vertebrates, so animals that have a backbone. So when we're talking about immunology from this point on, I'm talking about animals that have a backbone. So like not like, I don't know, little, some sort of reptile or something. I don't know. It's not, so innate immunity is the first line of defense against invading pathogens. So the innate immune response is a non-specific, immediate response. And so because it's non-specific, that means that it has no memory of the pathogen. Innate immunity, if any, I don't know if anyone remembers. So when babies are born, how do they kind of get a little bit of immunity?
From the mother's milk.
Right, yeah. So that will kind of help jumpstart their immune system. And so we'll talk about that again in a second. So this innate immune response is non-specific, so it will respond to any pathogen, and it's a very so the majority of pathogens are actually prevented from entering the body because of chemical or physical barriers. So one of the biggest barriers that keeps pathogens from entering our body is our skin. So that's a really, really important organ. It's actually kind of considered an organ. And so if you have cuts or breaks in your skin, obviously that barrier is broken, and so pathogens can get in that way. And it's the same with animals. If they have a cut anywhere, that's going to make them more likely to get bacteria in there and get an infection, because that does prevent the majority of pathogens. So most pathogens that do enter will be destroyed within minutes or hours by these innate defenses. So these non-specific defenses that happen immediately will typically cover most pathogens, but it's the ones that they don't that cause a problem. So like I said, skin provides a physical and chemical barrier with the keratinized epidermis, which is just your outer layer of skin, and that is impermeable to microorganisms. So as long as you don't have any cuts or anything, your skin will be protecting you and the animals. So there's an oily secretion or sebum that contains fatty acids and a low pH that provides an environment that's not conducive to pathogens. So when pathogens get on your skin, that kind of oil secretion, it also helps kind of kill them and make an environment they don't want to live in, and to keep them from getting into your body. Mucous membranes are another barrier of protection. So they are in the gastrointestinal tract, the respiratory tract, mammary glands, and reproductive tracts. So in the mucous membranes, you'll have kind of immune cells that will keep pathogens from kind of invading that tissue further. Of course, there are going to be times when that's not enough. So in the mucous membranes, you can be, or animals can be protected with enzymes such as lysozyme, which if you think back to the cells, the lysosomes degrade foreign particles in the cell or old cell parts. So lysozyme would help degrade pathogens. Mucus films, low pH. So low pH is important because a lot of pathogenic bacteria don't like a low pH, and they can't survive in a low pH. So that can actually be really important. Antimicrobial chemicals, obviously the antimicrobials kill microbes or bad pathogens, and surfactant protein. So also part of the innate immune system are antimicrobial peptides and proteins. So they are an integral part of the epithelial defense barrier. So for example, epithelial cells would be the cells that line your gastrointestinal tract. As an example, you have epithelial cells in other places too. but they have these antimicrobial peptides and proteins because that epithelial barrier is going to be what the microbes, if you ingest anything, are going to be coming into contact with. And I actually had a ton of questions on this yesterday. So they're genome-coded pattern recognition receptors or pattern recognition molecules found on pathogens that are not found on the cells of the animal. So different pathogens have kind of different, we'll call them PRRs, so different patterns that can be recognized by receptors on the cells in our body. And so those receptors look for specific patterns associated with bacteria. And so they won't look for patterns associated with like our own cells, because obviously you don't want your immune cells to attack your self cells. So microbe-associated molecular patterns, or MAMPs, is what these receptors will recognize. And so when these receptors recognize those patterns, so that tells that cell, okay, this is a bacteria, this is not a body cell, then it will allow the phagocytes to engulf invading pathogens. And it will also start signaling more immune responses. So it will signal the release of other immune chemicals and cells to kind of let everybody know, hey, there's a pathogen trying to invade, we need to deal with this. So the innate host defense also includes the production of antimicrobial proteins known as defensins. So that could be one way that they're going to deal with the pathogen. Again, they could be also like letting the rest of the body know, or the rest of that organ know, and recruiting other immune cells. So defensins will also signal the adaptive immune response. So remember, right now we're talking about innate immunity. That's not specific. It's going to recognize any pathogen and start a response to it. So part of this response will signal what comes next, which is the adaptive immune response. So still talking about innate immunity, phagocytes are part of innate immunity. So what these are is they are a type of immune cell. And so they're resident macrophages and recruited neutrophils. And so both of those are just specific types of immune cells. And we're not going to go into really the differences of exactly what each of those do, but just know that they're immune cells that help in an immune response. And so their kind of overall function is to engulf invading organisms and then respond with what's called a respiratory burst. So they'll basically just release highly reactive oxygen that includes the superoxide radical and hydrogen peroxide. So basically, highly reactive oxygen, if a molecule, some molecules can become highly reactive depending on the number of electrons they have. If they have an unpaired electron, they can be extremely reactive because they can actually destroy other molecules by pulling electrons off of those molecules. So they can damage DNA and lots of different things. So highly reactive oxygen would also damage a pathogen. So this is really important part of the immune system. So the respiratory burst will help kill internalized bacteria, and it acts as a second messenger that activates signaling pathways within that cell and to other immune cells. So throughout an immune response, cells are constantly communicating with cells nearby and maybe even cells that are a little bit further away. Because if one cell is invaded, then that signal needs to be sent out to other cells so that that can be dealt with properly. And the immune system is really, really complex. I've learned from trying to learn about it, but I'm just going to try to hit a little bit on the basics, but it is very intense. So part of the innate immune response is inflammation. So like if you have ever had an injury and then you had a lot of swelling or a lot of heat in that area, that's the innate immune response trying to get rid of an infection. So what happens during inflammation is increased blood flow due to vasodilation. So there will be dilation of the blood vessels to kind of get more blood to that area, and swelling. And so the reason that more blood needs to go to that area and this swelling occurs is because if you've ever had swelling and you felt it, it's been really, really hot. And that's because your body is trying to heat that area because a lot of pathogens can't tolerate that temperature rise. So your body's trying to heat that area specifically to go ahead and kill that pathogen. Of course, if it becomes more of a problem, you're going to probably get a fever, and that's when your whole body temperature is being raised by your immune system to fight off that pathogen. So I've always kind of heard that sometimes if you don't have an extreme fever, it's almost better not to take anything to break it, and just kind of have that, like, low-grade fever for a little while, because your body is doing that to kill off a pathogen. Of course, if your fever is getting out of control, you need to do something. And I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know, but that's what I've heard before. So that's this increased blood flow and inflammation is one of the first immune responses to infection, and it's caused by histamine that's produced by mast cells, which is just another type of immune cell, eicosanoids, and cytokines that are released by injured or infected cells. So like I said, when those cells recognize that there's a pathogen, they're going to start a cascade of events, and that's going to cause all of these different cells to release these different compounds that are going to trigger this inflammatory response. So inflammation is then followed by what's called phagocytosis. So we just talked about the phagocytes. So all that means is that those microorganisms are going to be engulfed by the phagocytic cells. So as you can see in this picture on the right, so this would be a phagocytic cell, and so you see this little bacteria here, the little red circle, and so all that immune cell is doing is just engulfing that bacteria, and then it's going to bring it into the cell, and then you can see that the lysosome is going to produce lysozyme, and it's going to be degraded, and then the debris will be sent out of the cell. So that organism has been neutralized, it's been dealt with, and this phagocyte has engulfed it. So that's kind of a simple immune response that happens with innate immunity. Any questions on that? So other aspects of the innate immune system, because it does involve a lot of different components, interferons that are produced following viral infection and inhibit viral replication. So just like those cells have receptors to recognize bacteria, viruses also cause infection. So they also have receptors to recognize viruses. And so those receptors that recognize a virus are going to cause a different response than bacteria, because viruses and bacteria need to be dealt with in different ways. So these interferons will be produced instead of some of the other compounds. They will be produced specifically in a viral infection. So the immune system can kind of get pretty dynamic in how it responds to different pathogens. Complement is just the term for serum proteins that can destroy pathogens. So some cells can actually, they kill pathogens by what's called the complement system, and that's just by recruiting these proteins that can help in killing that pathogen. And then cytokines, or chemical messengers, they're just messengers that are produced by the cells that have recognized a bacteria, and basically those messengers go and tell the other immune cells and other parts of the body, hey, we have an organism that's invading, we need to deal with this. You know, you're a cell, you need to go here, and they'll kind of direct the immune response, direct the cells, and it's really pretty intricate. It's pretty cool, but there's a lot of different things going on. So like I said, the innate immune response will be the first response, and it's non-specific, and so then things that happen throughout that innate response, if it is serious enough to where the innate immune system cannot deal with it, the innate immune system needs help. So that's when this second system comes into play, and that's your adaptive immunity. So there are two types of adaptive immunity. There's humoral, which is what involves antibodies, and then there's cell-mediated, which involve communication between cells. So adaptive immunity is going to be specific immunity. Adaptive immunity will have memory because it's adaptive, so it's adapted to organisms that, you know, have been seen by the body before. So it's going to be a much more specific. So for example, if you were exposed to some sort of bacteria when you were little, your body has memory of that specific bacteria. And so if it invades again, your adaptive immune response will take care of it much faster than it did the first time, because it has memory, where the innate immune system doesn't. So it's kind of cool, I think, that the adaptive immune system can remember anything you've come into contact with ever. So two types of cells that are involved in adaptive immunity are T cells and B cells. And so T cells originate from the thymus, and B cells come from the bone marrow. So I always thought it was pretty convenient because T cells come from the thymus, which starts with a T, and B cells come from the bone marrow, which starts with a B. I love it when things like that happen because it makes it easy for me to remember. So you see I have T and B underlined there to keep those straight. The T cells are just involved in that cell-mediated immunity, and B cells are going to be the cells that are going to produce antibodies when a pathogen comes into the body. So these cells will migrate to what are called secondary lymphoid organs, so kind of organs that contain lymphocytes or other immune cells. So those organs would be like your spleen, lymph nodes, Peyer's patches, which are found in the gut, and that's all to fight infection. Just a little bit, a few definitions to kind of help you understand adaptive immunity. So an antigen is simply just a molecule that can induce an immune response. Anything that induces an immune response can be an antigen. So antigens are then going to be targeted by antibodies that are going to deal with the antigens. And one thing that is interesting to remember is that it's anything that can induce an immune response. So an antigen could actually be part of the host itself in the case of an autoimmune disease, where the body no longer recognizes its own cells and it's attacking its own cells. Those cells are technically, to the immune system, being considered an antigen. But so anything that causes an immune response, bacteria, virus, fungi, anything. So an antibody, they're also called immunoglobulins. That's kind of the fancy immunology word. Antibody is the word we'll just use for this class. But just so you know, it's the same thing. Is a protein that's produced, usually and used by the immune system to neutralize pathogens. So B cells will produce antibodies that will then go and bind to that antigen. And depending on the type of antibody, it will cause different types of events to happen, and they will neutralize that pathogen. So antibodies are extremely important. And the cool thing about antibodies is that B cells can make antibodies specific to an antigen. So if you have like an infection with a specific strain of E. coli, like I'm using my pigs as an example, we infected them with a specific type of E. coli, and then we looked at the antibodies that they generated for that specific E. coli, because they will generate a specific antibody for that pathogen, not just a general response. It's very, very targeted. So it's very interesting, I think. So a pathogen is just anything that can produce disease. So example, bacteria and viruses. So just to keep that straight, pathogen can produce disease. Antigen just is anything that can trigger an immune response. So adaptive immunity, like I said, has two parts. So you have your humoral immunity or your antibody or cell-mediated immunity. Cell-mediated and is kind of the same. And so there are 5 classes of antibodies, or the immunoglobulins in mammals, that are produced by B cells. And so you don't really need to know specifically what each one of these do. I didn't really get into that until I was a little bit further into anatomy and physiology. But just so you can kind of see that each one has its own function, I'm just going to kind of go over it really quickly. So IgA, or in that IG just stands for immunoglobulin. It's an important component to first-line defense, again, and it's mostly in mucosal tissue. IgD is an antigen receptor on B cells, so it recognizes pathogens. IgE will induce the release of histamine from those mast cells. So if you are having a lot of inflammation or an allergic response, IgE is going to be present in pretty good concentrations. IgG is the major humoral agent that combats disease. So IgG is actually the antibody that will be most often found in the blood in the case of an infection. And so that's really cool because IgG can go all throughout your body to bind this antigen if it gets to that point. And then IgM is the first humoral agent that combats disease. So when a disease is first in the beginning stages of infecting the body, IgM is going to be the one that's present. And so mainly the reason that all of these are important is because these can be measured, especially from a blood sample. And so you kind of know, okay, well, if there's a lot of IgM, this is kind of a new infection, because after a point, IgM will no longer be around. So it's just good to know kind of which each of these, what each of these do. And so that can be an indicator of kind of where the infection is and what's going on. But also just to see how the wide variety of responses that the body can mount. So part of adaptive immunity is passive immunity, or the maternal transfer of antibodies, particularly IgG to the progeny, which just means offspring, via 3 mechanisms. So transport across the placenta. So during gestation, obviously the dam or the mother is going to be connected to the fetus through the placenta. So antibodies and things like that can be transferred. And then transfer in first milk or colostrum, like we said, is really important because that will transfer those antibodies so that the new animal has, or baby animal has, some sort of immunity. And so actually it can also be transferred to the chick embryo through ingestion of the yolk. So cell-mediated immunity is the other type of adaptive immunity. And so that is really, really important when a pathogen has entered a cell. So kind of all of these other immune responses are when the cells are recognizing that an organism is in the body, but it hasn't necessarily invaded the body's cells yet. Once it enters the body's cells, then you have a second, you have the cell-mediated immunity that needs to take over from there because it's actually invaded the cells. So antibodies can't cross the membrane of cells. So therefore, humoral immunity is less effective once the pathogen has gotten into the cell. So those B cells are producing all of those immunoglobulins, all those antibodies, but if that pathogen gets into the cell, those antibodies can't follow it into the cell. And so something has to be in place within the cell to then take over from there. Does that make sense? Okay. So cells that provide cell-mediated immunity are those T cells that we talked about. So B cells are going to produce the antibodies and handle the humoral response. And then once it gets into the cell, T cells are going to start taking over. Okay, so that was kind of the really heavy immunology information. So now we're going to kind of go back to a little bit more basic. So we're going to talk about nutrition and genetics and how that can contribute to disease resistance. Or contribute to disease. So nutrition is really, really important. Obviously, I think so because I'm a nutritionist, so I tend to get really excited about nutrition. So we've talked about before how animals have to have their nutrient requirements met. And so the deficiency of a required nutrient will actually impair the animal's ability to be able to fight an invasion by pathogens, because the animals need nutrients, and they need those to get energy to be able to do things in the body, to grow. And then the immune system, the immune response requires energy. So if the animals don't have enough nutrients, they're not going to have an efficient immune system. So genetics can also play a big part in this. So there's variation in the susceptibility of animals to diseases. So not all animals may be susceptible to the same disease. Not even all breeds. So for example, some breeds of pigs, it was discovered that they were actually resistant to a particular type of E. coli. And so once that gene was found, those animals could then be kind of selected, and producers started breeding for animals that were resistant to that type of E. coli. And so it's pretty interesting because that resistance popped up in certain breeds compared to others. The genetics can play a big role. Livestock selection for improved performance has reduced disease resistance, so or improved disease resistance, that should say. So it's made animals healthier, and so they wouldn't get as many diseases. So it's now possible to select for disease resistance, like I said. So people will select animals that they know are more resistant to a pathogen, and hopefully that will be transferred to their offspring through the genetics. So vaccines and drugs are, of course, another way to keep animals healthy and to deal with disease. So just to remind you again, an antigen is just a protein or anything foreign to the body, such as viruses or bacteria, that produces an immune response. And so something called an adjuvant is a mixture of chemicals that can actually act to stimulate the cell-mediated and humoral immune responses and actually deliver that antigen to the body's antigen-presenting cells. So it basically shows that antigen to the immune cells that are going to trigger a response. So vaccines are basically just a mixture of the antigen, so what it is that's going to trigger an immune response, and this adjuvant that is just a mixture of chemicals that antigen gets to the immune cells and produces a response. So sometimes this could be a killed organism. If it's an organism that is really, really pathogenic and can cause disease very quickly and is kind of hard to control, you obviously don't want to inject an animal or a person with the full version of that, let's say, virus. So a killed organism, even though it's killed, your body will still recognize it as foreign, and it will respond, and it will still remember that organism should you ever come into contact with the live version. So another option is a live, attenuated, or a weakened organism in the modified live vaccine. So again, this is kind of an intermediate step where you're not using a killed organism, but you're not using a live organism. So it might be an organism that if it's just a little bit weakened, it's not going to cause a full infection, but it's enough for your immune system to recognize it. Another option is to use the protein from that organism. And so the receptors on the immune cells that recognize pathogens will recognize certain things associated with the pathogen. So a vaccine may just inject a protein that those receptors will recognize, and those receptors still think that they've come into contact with the whole pathogen. So that's another interesting way that vaccines can be done. And so then toxoid or tetanus-causing organisms, of course, I'm sure all of you have had a tetanus shot at some point. So vaccines can be really, really helpful. There are vaccines available for cattle, pigs, poultry, horses. There's also for horses, the Coggins test for equine infectious anemia, which is a serious viral disease of horses for which there's no vaccine. So that's kind of an exception. A vaccine's not available for that. So there's tests that you can do for it. Dogs and cats, there are the core vaccinations, so like rabies and distemper would be those kind of core required vaccinations. And then there are optional vaccinations, so like kennel cough that they kind of recommend if you're going to board your dog. They don't have to have it. They do if they're going to be boarded, but that's kind of optional because that's kind of a disease that they could be treated for and they could get over relatively quickly, whereas rabies and distemper could be fatal. So vaccines are going to be required for those. So vaccine for the treatment of canine melanoma is the first therapeutic vaccine for the treatment of animal or human cancer. So melanoma is skin cancer, and so there is a vaccine for the treatment of skin cancer in dogs, which is really, really impressive that medicine has been able to do that. There are a lot of different drugs that can be used to help keep animals healthy. So prophylactic drugs are used to prevent disease rather than treat disease because everyone's kind of getting on board with if we can prevent the disease from happening, that's better than having to treat it afterwards. And then, of course, there are drugs for dogs against fleas, ticks, heartworm, hookworm, and other parasites like we talked about on Tuesday. And these prophylactic drugs can also be used for livestock and horses to reduce the impact of both internal and external parasites. And then antibiotics, of course, are used therapeutically to treat specific disease and as growth promotants to improve livestock efficiency. And remember, that is what they were used for in the past, and some of those antibiotics, not all of them, but some of them have already been removed for use as growth promotants in livestock efficiency. If you think back to when we talked about the veterinary feed directive, their kind of goal is to only have to use antibiotics when an animal is sick. So that's basically kind of where the industry is going. So drugs and hormones can be used to increase production efficiency in livestock. So antibiotics, like I said, can do that, but some of them are already being removed for that purpose. Estrogen, somatotropin, adrenergic agonist, and ionophores, which we talked about a little bit in previous lectures. And then anesthetics and analgesics. Yeah, I can't say that word. Um, so basically sedatives, and then non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to reduce arthritis pain. There are drugs available for companion animals because we do kind of keep them around until old age. So kind of like humans, they may need to be on some medications once they get a little bit older. So osteoarthritis can be a problem in older animals. So there's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that inhibit the enzyme, cyclooxygenase, and reduce prostaglandin production and pain that's associated with osteoarthritis. For heart disease, there are drugs that can help treat heart failure in dogs just by lowering their blood pressure and reducing the fluid in their lungs. So it kind of takes the pressure off of the heart. Other companion animal drugs that are available are for endocrine diseases. So there's a drug that's available to treat Addison's disease, which right now I cannot remember exactly what Addison's disease is. So skin diseases, there are drugs that antifungal agents, antibiotics, and anti-inflammatories. Mental health for dogs. If you have a dog that just gets really, really stressed out or really anxious and you really want to put them on something and pay that extra expense, there are drugs that can reduce separation anxiety and kind of calm the animal down. If you have a dog that just tears up your house every time you leave, it may be something to kind
of... Dr. Brooks?
Yes.
Addison's disease is a disorder that occurs when your body produces insufficient amounts of certain hormones produced by your adrenal glands.
Okay.
Primarily too little cortisol.
Okay, so too little stress hormone.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, I had heard of it before, but for some reason when it was like escaping me what it was. It never stuck with me when I learned it.
Yes. Looking at the symptoms, I may have it. Extreme fatigue, weight loss, decreased appetite, darkening of skin, low blood pressure, nausea, abdominal pain, irritability, depression.
That's not good.
No, I don't have it. I was just joking, but...
Well, I feel like some of those like symptoms are like super generic for so many diseases. It's like I am tired a lot. Like my appetite fluctuates, but it's like you get on WebMD and start looking at symptoms of everything. You don't know if you have something minor or something like really major.
Yeah, but the weight loss combined with the darkening of the skin and salt craving, those are fairly specific. So
yeah.
Otherwise, I have it.
Salt craving?
Salt craving, yes.
That's interesting. Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Carry on.
So there are also novel approaches to combat disease. So novel is kind of new. So genetic selection, including candidate genes, can increase the resistance of livestock to diseases. So like I talked about, pigs being bred for F18 E. coli resistance. Probiotics or direct-fed microbials, which is what I've been working with for the last 3.5 years. So those are just benign microorganisms, so they don't cause infection, that improve the environment in the gastrointestinal tract to kind of make a better environment, animal healthy, and then hopefully make them grow more. Their responses have been really kind of inconsistent, so they're not quite as good as antibiotics, but they are an option. Bacteriophages are viruses that will infect a specific bacterium. And bacteriocins are chemicals that are produced by bacteria that can kill other bacteria. So in the body, there are already some microbes there. And so especially in the gastrointestinal tract is where they are. And so those microorganisms that are already in your gastrointestinal tract could produce these bacteriocins that would kill invading bacteria because they want to kind of also keep their home pathogen. So that's the end of that PowerPoint. Does anybody have any questions on that? It was kind of a lot with the immune stuff, but I'm not going to go too specific.